Back in the 1300s, it was common for people to go to sleep feeling fine, only to wake up sick and dying. A nasty fever would hit out of nowhere. People would get these awful, dark swellings under their arms and on their necks. Whole families could be wiped out in just days, sometimes even hours. Church bells were ringing all the time, so often that people stopped counting the dead. Graveyards got too full. Streets became quiet. All over Europe, people were scared and asking the same thing: was this the end? What they didn't know then was that they were living through the worst disease outbreak in history. It wiped out maybe half the population of Europe and changed how society worked forever. This was the Black Death, and once it started, there was no getting away from it. To really get how bad things got, you need to know what life was like before. The early 1300s weren't some dark age, like people think. It was actually a great time in the Middle Ages. Things were pretty stable, the population was growing fast, and Europe was more connected than it had been since the Roman Empire. Because the weather was good during what's called the medieval warm period, there were plenty of crops for years. Europe's population almost doubled in 200 years. Cities were growing bigger than their old Roman walls could hold. Places such as Paris, Florence, Venice, and London were lively, messy, and packed with people. Those big Gothic churches were being built, showing how people felt closer to God and more advanced than ever. Most importantly, the world was linked up. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that came all the way from Asia without even leaving the trade routes set up by the Mongol Empire, the Pax Mongolica. This huge network was like the internet back then. It moved spices, gold, ideas, and new technologies across continents really fast. It was a great time, full of energy and hope. But this global network wasn't all good. Those same caravans and ships that brought wealth were about to bring the worst disaster ever. The system for a worldwide catastrophe was all set. This society, which seemed so strong, was about to face something it couldn't see, understand, or fight. The start of this disaster was way over in Central Asia, thousands of miles from the stone streets of Paris, probably around Kyrgyzstan or northern China today. The area has extreme weather, with huge grasslands, freezing winters, and scorching summers. For ages, there was this germ living there called Yersinia pestis. It's a really strong bacterium that was common in the rodents living in the steppes, like marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, the bacteria and the rodents lived together without much trouble, far from where people lived. But around the 1330s, something messed up the balance in the steppes. Experts think there was some kind of environmental problem, maybe a bad drought followed by a lot of rain, and it wiped out the rodents' food supply. Because they were starving, the infected rodents moved closer to where people lived, bringing their fleas along with them. The disease jumped from animals to people in the trading posts along the Silk Road. The first people to get sick probably didn't know what was happening. They got high fevers, started throwing up, and had these horrible, painful swellings in their lymph nodes, the buboes, which is where the disease got its name. News traveled slowly back then, but rumors of bad stuff spread faster than traders. By the early 1340s, scary stories started showing up in Mediterranean ports. Traders were talking about civilizations disappearing in the east, about reigns of fire and diseases that left India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia empty. People in Europe heard these stories and were horrified but also felt distant from it, like it was happening in faraway lands as punishment for other people's beliefs. They didn't know about germs. They didn't realize that the spices they were using were traveling the same route as the thing that would kill them. The most important place in this story is the Crimean Peninsula, which sticks out into the Black Sea. There was this amazing city there called Caffa. Caffa wasn't just a city, it was a strong, rich colony of the Republic of Genoa. It was the key link between the land routes from Asia and the sea routes in the Mediterranean. Inside its big stone walls were Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and all kinds of people protected by Genoese soldiers. In 1346, Caffa was under attack. The powerful army of the Golden Horde, which came from the Mongol Empire and was led by Khan Yani Beg, had surrounded the city. The Genoese were good at defending themselves and getting supplies by sea, so the siege lasted for months without either side winning. But then, this silent killer started spreading in the Mongol camps. The army was living close together in dirty conditions, which was perfect for the bacteria that had come with them from the east. Soldiers started dying in huge numbers. Their bodies would turn dark with gangrene before they died. The Mongol army wasn't losing to the enemy but to this disease. Yani Beg saw his army falling apart and made a terrible choice that changed everything. He decided to use the dead bodies of his soldiers as a weapon. He ordered his men to load the bodies onto catapults. For days, dead bodies rained down on Caffa. The Genoese soldiers were terrified as the infected corpses crashed onto roofs and into the town square. It was a scary situation, and the disease spread quickly. The bacteria, in the fluids of the corpses and the fleas that left the dead bodies for living ones, got into the city. The strong fortress had been beaten from the inside. Everyone in Caffa panicked. The rich Genoese merchants knew the city was lost, so they used their ships to escape. 12 ships full of people, goods, and some hidden things sailed out of the harbor, past the dying Mongol army, and headed home. They sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which was also about to be hit hard, and into the Mediterranean Sea. This sea was the center of trade in Europe, with lots of fast-moving ships. The ships that were escaping became carriers of death, stopping at different ports to get supplies and spreading the disease everywhere they went without knowing it. The first big port to be hit was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese ships got there, the dockworkers saw a terrible sight. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on the ships. The few who were still alive were confused, in a lot of pain, and covered in black boils that were oozing blood and pus. The people in charge of the port in Messina realized what was happening too late. They told the ships to leave, but the rats that carried the fleas were already on the docks. Messina was the first place in Europe to be hit, and it went badly. The disease spread fast. The crowded conditions of the port city made things worse. In just weeks, society in Messina fell apart. People ran away to the countryside, but that just spread the disease even more. The news about the great sickness spread, and other ports tried to keep ships from the east out. But it didn't really work. People were greedy, and ships with valuable goods could often bribe their way into ports. By the start of 1348, the great sea trading cities were falling apart. Genoa, where the ships from Caffa had come from, was in bad shape. Venice was facing a huge threat. The people of Venice, who were good at business, came up with the idea of the Lazaretto islands in the lagoon where ships and their crews had to wait 40 days before coming into the city. It was a smart idea for public health, but it was too late for the first wave of the disease. The boats in Venice became like funeral ships, carrying piles of bodies through the quiet canals. From the Italian ports, the disease moved west to Marseilles, which was the gateway to France, and across the sea to Dubrovnik. The edges of Europe had been hit. Now, the disease moved inland. As the plague spread away from the coasts, along rivers and roads, it reached the crowded heart of Europe. Cities such as Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona had walls around them with narrow, winding streets, tall wooden houses that blocked out the sun, and open sewers running down the streets. They were lively and rich, but they were also breeding grounds for disease. When the plague hit a city, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city itself. It's hard to imagine how scary it was to face this without modern science. The smartest people at the time, the doctors at the University of Paris, were confused. They believed in old Greek ideas about bad air causing disease. They thought the air had been poisoned, maybe by the planets aligning in a certain way in 1345, which released bad fumes. Doctors told people not to take baths because it opened their pores to the bad air. They burned nice-smelling woods to fight the smell of death. They bled patients, which made them even weaker. They cut open the boils, which just spread the infection faster. Everything they tried just seemed to make things worse. They realized that what they knew was useless. An Italian writer named Giovanni Boccaccio saw the destruction in Florence, which lost maybe 60% of its people, and wrote about how society fell apart. People were so scared of catching the disease that they broke the most important human connections. Boccaccio wrote about fathers leaving their sons and wives leaving their husbands to die alone. Sick people were locked up in their homes. Life stopped working. Laws were ignored because there was no one to enforce them. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The sounds of a busy city were replaced by silence, except for the constant ringing of church bells. Until the bell ringers died or the authorities stopped the bells to keep people from panicking. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Churchyards were full, so they dug big pits where bodies were stacked like wood, covered with a little bit of dirt. Back then, people didn't separate the physical world from the spiritual world. They thought something this big had to be a punishment from God for their sins. The church, which was the foundation of life in the Middle Ages, was facing a huge challenge. People went to churches to pray for help, gathering in crowds that just spread the disease faster. When prayers didn't work, some people became really extreme in their beliefs. A group called the flatulence started traveling across Northern Europe. These were groups of men who would march from town to town, take off their shirts, and whip themselves in public, hoping to take the world's sins onto themselves and calm God's anger. They were a scary sight, causing panic everywhere they went. As more people died, people looked for someone to blame. A terrible idea started spreading, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain, that Jewish people were poisoning the wells to kill Christians. Even though the Pope said this wasn't true, people went crazy. Because they had hated Jewish people for centuries and wanted to blame someone, they started attacking them. Whole Jewish communities were burned alive in cities such as Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne. The Black Death brought out not just disease but also the worst parts of human nature. It's wrong to think of the plague as just a city problem. While cities were hit hard, most people in Europe lived in the countryside. The plague spread there too, carried by people running away from the cities or traveling workers. The damage in the countryside was slower, but it might have been even bigger in the long run. Thousands of small villages were completely wiped out. The system of farming, where peasants worked for lords, stopped working. People at the time wrote about how strange the countryside looked, crops rotting in the fields because there was no one to harvest them. Sheep and cows wandering around because all the shepherds were dead. Wolves, who were usually scared of people, started coming closer to where people lived. The carefully managed land was turning back into wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached the far north of Europe, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the small settlements in Greenland. It had spread across the whole continent. By 1351, the worst of the Black Death was over. The bacteria had run out of people to infect. The situation started to improve, and it showed a continent that had been changed. No one will ever know exactly how many people died, but experts think that between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, maybe half the population died in less than 5 years. Those who survived came out into a world that looked the same but was very different. At first, there was economic chaos and prices went up, but then something amazing happened. Because so many people had died, there was a shortage of workers. For the first time in centuries, peasants had power. Lords had to offer better pay and conditions to get people to work their land. The old system of serfdom started to fall apart. The golden age of the laborer had begun, rising from the ashes of the plague. The psychological effects were serious. Art started to focus on death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became popular, showing skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants to the grave, reminding everyone that death comes to all. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to Western civilization. It destroyed the optimism of the Middle Ages and showed how easily human systems can be beaten by nature. The society that rebuilt itself was more doubtful, more questioning, and forced to change. The path of death led to the slow, painful start of the modern world. For centuries, the Black Death was just a story from the past. But empty streets, locked homes, fear of the air. Does that really sound like ancient history? Or does it feel familiar? The plague tested civilization. And those tests have a way of happening again.